February 11th, 976 AD. A Viking settlement on Iceland's northern coast. The firewood ran out 3 days ago. The last piece of driftwood was burned yesterday. Outside, a blizzard has been raging for 6 days straight, making it impossible to venture out for peat or dried seaweed. Inside the longhouse, 43 people huddled together in the growing cold. The central hearth holds only dying embers. Children have stopped crying. They're too weak from hunger and cold. By morning, 7 people are dead, including the chieftain's wife and 2 infants. They didn't freeze to death dramatically. They just drifted into hypothermia sleep and never woke up. This wasn't a rare disaster. This was a constant possibility every single winter across Scandinavia. The firewood could run out. The peat could be exhausted. Storms could trap you inside for weeks. And when your primary heat source failed, you had maybe 48 hours before death started claiming victims. How do you survive when the fire dies? Here's what historians don't tell you about Viking winters. The popular image shows endless supplies of firewood stacked high, roaring fires burning all winter, warriors feasting by warm hearths. That's a complete fantasy. The reality was brutal fuel scarcity. In Iceland and Greenland, there were no trees. 0. Not a single forest. Every piece of wood had to be imported at enormous cost or scavenged as driftwood from beaches, wood that had floated thousands of kilometers across the Arctic Ocean and might appear once or twice per year. Even in mainland Scandinavia, where forests existed, gathering firewood required immense labor. A single longhouse needed approximately 6 cubic meters of wood per WEEK during winter. That's the equivalent of 15 full-grown trees monthly. 90 trees for a 6-month winter. Multiply that by a village of 10 households, and you're talking about 900 trees per winter. Forests couldn't regenerate fast enough. Within a few generations, nearby woodlands were stripped bare, forcing people to travel farther and farther for fuel. And during the worst winters, when storms prevented expeditions, fuel supplies could be exhausted weeks before spring arrived. What I'm about to show you is how Vikings survived when the unthinkable happened, when the fire went out and couldn't be relit. The survival strategies they developed weren't about having more wood. They were about needing less wood, using every possible alternative heat source, and most radically, learning to survive in temperatures where modern people would die within hours, even with heating. This required a completely integrated system where architecture, clothing, food, community structure, and psychology all worked together to keep humans alive when their primary survival tool, fire, was gone. Every element had to compensate for the missing heat source. Remove any one component, and the entire system collapsed, taking everyone with it. Stay with me, because the first secret to surviving without fire is something that seems completely unrelated to warmth, but it's actually the foundation of, quote, everything else. Let me tell you about the real Viking survival weapon. And it had nothing to do with axes or shields. It was something so fundamental that modern people have almost entirely forgotten its importance: community cohesion as a biological heating system. In a world where fire could fail at any moment, the most reliable heat source wasn't wood. It was human bodies working together as one coordinated thermal mass. This wasn't just social nicety or cultural tradition. This was cold, hard survival physics that kept people alive when everything else failed. And it required psychological engineering as sophisticated as any architectural design. Here's the mathematics of survival that Vikings understood intuitively. An individual human body generates approximately 100 watts of heat continuously through metabolic processes. That's equivalent to a bright, incandescent bulb. One person alone in a cold room struggles to maintain body temperature because their heat generation barely compensates for surface area losing warmth to surrounding air. But 40 people in one confined space, that's 4,000 watts of continuous heat generation, equivalent to 4 modern space heaters running simultaneously in a well-insulated longhouse. This biological heat alone could raise interior temperature 10 to 15 degrees Celsius above outside air, even with zero fire. This wasn't theory. This was observed, measured reality that meant the difference between life and death. When firewood ran critically low, Vikings deliberately packed everyone into the smallest possible space, maximizing this human heat concentration. The longhouse wasn't just shelter. It was a biological furnace using people as fuel. But maintaining this required something harder than architecture. It required keeping 40 or 50 people psychologically stable in a confined, dark space for months without descending into violence, depression, or panic that would destroy the group cohesion necessary for survival. This was where Viking social engineering became as sophisticated as their material technology. The longhouse was deliberately designed as a continuous activity space where everyone had assigned roles that kept them physically active and mentally occupied. Physical activity generates additional metabolic heat. A person doing moderate work produces 150 to 200 watts instead of 100. Vikings structured winter life, so there was always work happening. Men carved wood for ship repairs, maintained weapons, crafted tools. Women spun wool continuously. The spinning wheel rhythm was the constant background sound of winter survival. Children learned crafts, helping with simpler tasks. This wasn't about productivity for its own sake. It was about generating the extra 50 to 100 watts per person that could raise room, temperature another 5 degrees, and prevent the lethal combination of cold and boredom that breeds depression and conflict. The social activities served dual purposes: heat generation and psychological survival. Evening saga storytelling wasn't entertainment. It was group therapy disguised as tradition. The sagas reinforced cultural identity, gave people narratives of others who survived worse hardships, and most critically, they gathered everyone around the dying embers of the hearth, where collective body heat created the warmest zone. Board games like H-Nafadafel weren't recreation. They were cognitive engagement that prevented the apathy and despair that killed as surely as cold. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking mental health strategies were remarkably effective. While isolation and darkness cause severe psychological damage in modern polar researchers, despite all their technology, Viking societies maintained function through much longer darkness periods with far worse conditions. Their secret was understanding that survival was collective, not individual. The moment someone isolated themselves psychologically or physically from the group, they became a survival liability. The entire social structure, from seating arrangements to work assignments to storytelling schedules, was calibrated to prevent isolation and maintain the group's psychological cohesion that kept the biological heating system functioning. Can you imagine the psychological pressure of knowing that your depression or your conflict with another person could literally kill the entire community by disrupting the thermal mass. Yet Vikings lived with this reality every winter. But community warmth alone couldn't survive Arctic conditions. The architecture had to trap every calorie of heat generated. And what they built was revolutionary. Picture a building designed by someone who understood that every single calorie of heat lost is calories that must be replaced by burning precious fuel or consuming precious food. The Viking Longhouse in fuel-scarce regions like Iceland wasn't constructed like a normal building. It was built like a thermal flask, an insulated container designed with obsessive attention to preventing heat escape through any possible avenue. Let me show you the engineering that allowed these structures to maintain livable temperatures using nothing but body heat and minimal fire when fuel supplies failed. Every architectural decision was calculated against one metric: thermal efficiency. The first principle was minimizing the building's exposure to outside air. In Iceland and Greenland, Vikings didn't build houses on the ground. They dug into hillsides, creating semi-subterranean structures where up to half the building was below ground level. This exploited a critical physical principle. Soil at depths below 2 meters maintains relatively constant temperature year-round, regardless of surface conditions, typically around 8 to 10 degrees Celsius, even when surface air hits -30. By surrounding the longhouse with earth, they created a thermal buffer. The building couldn't get colder than the surrounding earth temperature, even if fire was completely absent. This meant interior temperature had a floor of around 5 to 8 degrees, even in the worst conditions, cold enough to be miserable, but above the wine lethal threshold where exposed humans die rapidly. Modern passive house designs are rediscovering this principle Vikings mastered a millennium ago. The walls were where thermal engineering reached its peak. Standard wall construction in fuel-poor Iceland consisted of a wooden frame filled with loose turf and clay, then covered on the exterior with a massive layer of stacked turf blocks. This turf layer was typically 1 meter thick, genuinely 1 full meter of packed earth and grass roots. To understand what this means thermally, modern insulation is measured in R value, resistance to heat flow. 1 meter of packed turf has an R value of approximately 15 to 20, comparable to 30 to 40 centimeters of modern fiberglass insulation. This meant that heat escaping through these walls was reduced to a tiny fraction of what would leak through wooden planks. Archaeological excavations consistently show these meter-thick walls were standard in Iceland, not exceptional. Vikings knew empirically that doubling wall thickness didn't double construction cost. It required maybe 50% more labor, but it quadrupled thermal performance. That was an investment that paid for itself the first winter when it saved enough fuel to keep the fire burning an extra week. The weight and mass of these turf walls also provided thermal inertia. They heated up slowly during the day when fire burned and bodies were active, then released that stored heat slowly through the night when fire died down. The building itself became a giant heat battery. The roof continued the insulation strategy. Birch bark provided the waterproof layer. This bark contains natural tar that's completely impermeable. On top of the bark came 2 thick layers of turf blocks, creating a roof often exceeding half a meter in thickness. This served triple duty: waterproofing, insulation, preventing heat escape upward, and massive weight that compressed everything below. eliminating air gaps where cold could penetrate. When winter snow accumulated on top, it added another insulation layer, sometimes exceeding 1 meter. The total roof insulation could reach R30 or higher, better than many modern buildings. But insulation was worthless if heat escaped through openings. Vikings minimized openings obsessively. The longhouse had essentially 0 windows. Windows are thermal disaster points where heat pours out. The only openings were one small entrance door, typically barely 1 meter high and 60 centimeters wide, covered with multiple layers of thick hide that acted as insulation curtains. The smoke hole in the roof was kept as small as physically possible while still allowing smoke escape, and it could be partially closed with adjustable wooden covers during extreme cold when fire was minimal. The interior space was kept deliberately low-ceilinged in most areas, except the central hall. Low ceilings meant less air volume to heat. Every cubic meter of air you don't heat is fuel you don't burn. The entire structure was engineered to be as close to airtight as possible, while still allowing minimal ventilation. This created an environment where 40 people's body heat alone could maintain interior temperature 10 to 15 degrees above outside air. When fire was added, even a small fire could push interior temperature to relatively comfortable 15 to 20 degrees Celsius. But without fire, that passive design kept people alive. How many modern buildings could maintain livable temperature using only body heat from occupants? Yet this was standard Viking engineering, driven by brutal fuel scarcity. But even the best insulation meant nothing if your body heat was leaking out through inadequate clothing. Everything changes when you understand that your clothes are your primary survival technology, not your house. The house creates a thermal envelope, but your body still needs its own personal insulation system that functions even when the house fails. Vikings developed clothing that was so thermally effective it allowed survival in conditions that would kill someone wearing modern winter gear. The secret was a material most people consider ordinary, but in its natural, minimally processed state, it has properties that modern synthetic fabrics still can't match. I'm talking about wool, specifically lanolin-rich wool that was deliberately underprocessed to maintain its natural protective coating. The miracle substance in Viking survival clothing was lanolin, a waxy secretion from sheepskin glands that coats every fiber of wool. Modern wool is heavily washed to remove this lanolin because it feels greasy and has a distinctive smell. Vikings did the opposite. They preserved maximum lanolin content because this grease made wool effectively waterproof. Water droplets beat it up and rolled off lanolin-coated wool instead of soaking in. Why does this matter for survival? Because moisture is the thermal killer. Wet fabric conducts heat away from your body approximately 25 times faster than dry fabric. Getting your wool wet in Arctic conditions means hypothermia and death within hours. But lanolin-rich wool stays dry even in humid, damp longhouse environments where everything else is perpetually moist from cooking steam, breathing, and lack of ventilation. This waterproofing wasn't total. Wool could still absorb water vapor, but it had an extraordinary property. It maintained insulating ability even when containing up to 30% water content by weight. The crimped fiber structure trapped air pockets that provided insulation regardless of moisture level. Modern synthetic fabrics lose almost all insulating value when wet. Wool is the only natural fiber that keeps you warm when damp, and Vikings exploited this ruthlessly. The Viking clothing system was based on sophisticated layering principles that modern outdoor companies market as revolutionary technology. They invented in the 20th century. Vikings were using these exact principles 1,000 years earlier through pure empirical observation. The system worked in 3 layers, each with specific thermal function. Layer 1 against skin was linen, not wool. This seems counterintuitive until you understand moisture management. The human body releases approximately half a liter of water vapor through breathing and perspiration during 8 hours of sleep or moderate activity. This moisture has to go somewhere. If it stays against your skin, it creates the deadly wet cold that causes hypothermia. Linen has excellent wicking properties. It pulls moisture away from skin through capillary action and passes it to outer layers. Your skin stays relatively dry, maintaining the critical thermal barrier. Linen was worn as a long shirt or serk reaching to knees, covering maximum body area. Over the linen base came 1 or more wool tunics. This was the primary insulation layer. The key was loose fit, creating air gaps between linen and wool layers. Still, air is one of the best insulators in existence. It has very low thermal conductivity. The trapped air between layers, warmed by body heat, created insulating pockets that minimized heat loss. Vikings intuitively understood what's now called dead air space principle. Multiple thin layers with air gaps between them provide vastly better insulation than one thick layer of the same total material thickness. The outermost layer was a heavy wool cloak or cape, ideally made from the densest, most heavily lanolin-saturated wool available. This outer layer served as wind barrier. Wind is devastating to insulation because it strips away the warm air layer surrounding your body. A windproof outer shell prevents this convective heat loss. The cloak was large, typically 1.5 by 2 meters, and deliberately heavy. This weight wasn't a disadvantage. It helped the cloak drape over the body, eliminating gaps where cold air could infiltrate. At night, this same cloak became your primary blanket. It was dual-purpose survival equipment. The feet received equal attention because frostbite starts at extremities where blood circulation is poorest. Wool pants were tucked into wool wraps, long strips of fabric wound tightly around lower legs from ankle to knee. This wrap system provided adjustable insulation. You could add or remove wraps based on conditions, and it prevented snow and cold air from getting up inside pant legs. Hands were covered with mittens. Never gloves. Mittens keep fingers together so they warm each other. Vastly more effective than gloves that isolate each finger. The head was always covered with a wool cap or hood because you lose 25 to 30% of body heat through an uncovered head due to heavy blood flow to the brain. Every extremity was protected because losing fingers, toes, ears, or nose to frostbite didn't just mean pain. It meant permanent disability that reduced your future survival capacity. Can you imagine the knowledge required to design this multi-layer system using only observation of what worked versus what killed people? Every detail was learned through trial, written in frozen corpses. But clothing and architecture still required some minimal fire for true survival. When fuel was desperate, what Vikings did with fire management was ingenious. When firewood supplies dropped to critical levels, and this happened every winter in fuel-scarce regions, Vikings had to make the fire last as long as physically possible, while still generating enough heat to prevent death. This required fuel economy strategies that would impress modern survival experts. The Langeld wasn't just a hearth, It was a carefully engineered combustion system designed to extract maximum heat from minimum fuel. Let me show you the techniques that stretched a 3-day fuel supply into 2 weeks of survival. The Langild's elongated shape, 10 to 20 meters long but only 50 to 80 centimeters wide, was fundamental to fuel efficiency. This geometry maximized the ratio of fire surface area to fuel consumed. Instead of one large fire requiring massive amounts of wood to maintain, Vikings created an extended fire line using far less total fuel, but distributing heat more effectively through the longhouse. Different sections could be burned in rotation, morning fire at one end for cooking, evening fire at the opposite end for warmth, where people gathered. This rotation meant the entire hearth was never burning simultaneously, cutting fuel consumption dramatically. When fuel was desperate, only the absolute minimum fire necessary for survival was maintained, maybe a 1-meter section, keeping a small amount of coals alive. But wood wasn't the only fuel. In Iceland, Greenland, and Faroe Islands, where wood was essentially non-existent, Vikings became masters of alternative fuel combustion. Peat was primary. This partially decomposed plant matter, dug from bogs, burned slowly and steadily, producing substantial heat. Peat has lower energy density than wood, about 70% of wood's heat output per kilogram, but it was abundant and free. The trick was proper drying. Wet peat won't burn effectively. Summer months were spent cutting peat blocks and stacking them in airy structures to dry for 6 months before use. Properly dried peat could keep a fire burning through the night on minimal fuel input. Dried seaweed was another option. Coastal Vikings collected massive amounts of kelp and seaweed, dried it for months, and burned it when wood ran out. The heat output was poor, maybe 40% of wood, and it produced acrid smoke that was even worse than wood smoke. But it was better than freezing. Animal dung was burned when nothing else remained. Dried sheep, cow, or horse manure contained enough combustible material to generate heat. The smell was terrible and heat output minimal. But desperate times demanded desperate measures. The fire management protocol during fuel crisis was strict and ritualized. Someone was always responsible for fire maintenance, typically rotating shifts through the night. The worst disaster wasn't running out of fuel. It was letting the fire die completely, because restarting fire from scratch using flint and steel could take an hour or more in desperate conditions, wasting precious fuel and creating a dangerous period where temperature plummeted. Instead, the fire was kept in smolder mode when fuel was critical. Coals would be buried under thick ash layers that restricted oxygen supply, causing extremely slow combustion. A properly banked fire could smolder for 12 to 16 hours on fuel that would burn completely in 2 hours if left exposed. Every few hours, someone would carefully uncover a section, add a tiny amount of fuel, allow it to catch and burn briefly, then rebank it. This kept minimal heat generation constant while stretching fuel dramatically. Children were taught from age 5 that the fire was sacred, not in religious sense, but in survival sense. Letting it die through negligence was unforgivable because it could kill everyone. The psychological pressure on whoever had fire watch duty must have been immense. How would you feel, knowing that falling asleep on your watch meant your entire family might die? But even the most carefully managed fire eventually runs out. What do you do when the last ember dies and cannot be relit? The answer is genuinely shocking. Here's what happens when the fire actually dies completely and cannot be restarted due to lack of fuel or inability to generate spark. Modern people assume this means everyone freezes to death immediately. Vikings proved that wrong. They developed protocols for surviving days without any fire at all, using nothing but their architecture, clothing, and most critically, their bodies as a collective heat source. This was the ultimate test of their integrated survival system. And archaeological evidence proves it worked. Settlements in the most fuel-desperate regions survived generations without adequate wood supplies. Let me explain the zero-fire survival protocol that seems impossible, but was regularly implemented. The first action when fire failed completely was immediate space compression. The entire community abandoned most of the longhouse and crowded into the smallest, most insulated section, typically the sleeping area at one end. 40 people who previously spread across 60 meters of longhouse now packed into maybe 15 square meters of space. At that density, people are literally pressed body to body with zero personal space. This maximized the biological heating effect. 40 bodies generating 100 watts each in 15 square meters creates incredible heat density, approximately 260 watts per square meter, comparable to modern radiant floor heating. Interior temperature in that compressed space could reach 12 to 15 degrees Celsius purely from body heat, even when outside temperature was -20. That's cold, but survivable for days if properly insulated. The survival sleeping arrangement became extreme. Everyone stripped to their dry linen base layers, removing the wool outer layers that would be needed later when moving. They packed together in the largest available Huthvat sleeping bags, sometimes 5 to 8 people per bag. If insufficient Huthvat existed, massive communal blankets made from sewn-together furs covered the entire group as one mass. The sleeping position was calculated. People alternated head-to-feet orientation, so everyone's torso, the highest heat-generating body section, was surrounded by other torsos. Infants and elderly were placed in the absolute center, surrounded by 3 or 4 layers of healthy adults. The group would literally not move for 12 to 16 hours at a time, maintaining the thermal mass. Movement was minimized because activity consumes calories and generates hunger. But food supplies during these crisis periods were also typically low. The strategy was entering a kind of human hibernation mode, minimal activity, maximum heat retention, survival until conditions improved enough to relight fire or reach alternative shelter. The psychological aspect of zero-fire survival was brutal. Imagine being pressed against 5 other people in pitch darkness because there's no fire. There's no light, unable to move. Cold, but not quite freezing. For multiple days, the darkness was absolute. The smell of concentrated, unwashed bodies was overwhelming. Some people invariably panicked, especially children. Maintaining calm required extraordinary community discipline. This is where the cultural emphasis on fate and acceptance became critical. You had to mentally accept the situation and trust the system rather than fighting it. Because fighting generated movement. Movement generated calorie burn. And calorie burn accelerated starvation. Sagas mention several historical instances where communities survived 3 to 5 days in zero-fire conditions, waiting for storms to pass, so they could venture out for fuel. The psychological toll was severe. Some people emerged from these experiences permanently traumatized, but physical survival was achieved. Can you imagine the mental strength required to remain motionless, pressed against strangers in freezing darkness for 72 hours, knowing that movement or panic could kill everyone. Yet this was accepted as possible necessity of winter survival. But zero fire survival was last resort. Normal winter strategy was maintaining minimal fire while supplementing with every other possible heat and light source. Light and heat are psychologically inseparable in human minds. Darkness triggers fear and depression even when temperature is adequate. Vikings understood this instinctively and developed lighting systems that were independent of the main fire, allowing light to continue even when fuel for the hearth was exhausted. These alternative light sources also generated small but significant amounts of heat that contributed to survival. The technology seems primitive, but was remarkably effective when you understand the engineering behind it. The primary alternative light source was the fat lamp, a simple technology with sophisticated implementation. These were small stone or clay bowls, typically 10 to 15 centimeters in diameter, filled with rendered animal fat or fish oil. A wick made from twisted plant fibers, usually dried moss, lint, or shredded fabric, was placed in the fat. When lit, these lamps burned steadily for hours, producing a small flame about 2 centimeters high. One lamp generated approximately 5 to 10 watts of light, dim by modern standards, equivalent to maybe a half-watt LED bulb, but sufficient to illuminate a 3-meter radius, enough for close detail work. More importantly, that small flame also generated 5 to 10 watts of heat. This seems trivial until you do the mathematics. 10 fat lamps distributed through the longhouse created 50 to 100 watts of heat generation, plus enough light to work by. That heat contribution was genuinely significant when fire was minimal. The fuel for these lamps was precious but separate from hearth fuel, making them economically viable even during firewood crisis. Fish oil was primary in coastal regions. Cod liver oil, seal blubber, whale fat all burned efficiently in lamps. The oil was rendered through slow heating, stored in sealed ceramic vessels, and rationed carefully. A liter of fish oil could power one lamp for approximately 60 to 80 hours of continuous burning. Inland regions used rendered animal fat from butchering, every scrap of fat from sheep, cattle, pigs was saved, rendered, and stored for winter lamp fuel. This fat had higher melting point than fish oil, requiring slightly warmer conditions to remain liquid, but it burned just as effectively. The wicks required maintenance. They had to be trimmed regularly to prevent smoking, and the lamp had to be cleaned periodically as residue accumulated. This wick trimming and lamp maintenance was typically women's work, a continuous background task throughout winter. The light these lamps provided had massive psychological impact during fuel crisis. Even when the main hearth was reduced to barely glowing coals, generating almost no visible light, fat lamps kept the interior from becoming pitch black. This prevented the terror of absolute darkness that breaks people mentally. The small flames also served as focus points for social gathering. People would cluster around lamp groups to work, similar to how they gathered around the hearth. This maintained social cohesion even when the main fire was failing. Work continued. Men carved wood or repaired tools by lamplight. Women spun wool. The spinning could be done almost by feel, requiring minimal light. This continuation of productive activity was crucial psychologically because it gave people purpose and distraction from their desperate situation. Archaeological evidence of extensive lamp use is found throughout Viking sites. Hundreds of small stone lamps have been recovered, showing wear patterns consistent with heavy, regular use. These weren't occasional backup lights. They were integral to the winter survival system. But light and heat still left people vulnerable if they consumed the calories maintaining body heat faster than they could replace them through food. The nutritional strategy during winter fuel crisis was as sophisticated as the thermal strategy. High-calorie foods were rationed specifically to maintain metabolic heat generation, while stretching supplies to match fuel availability. The winter diet was calculated for survival, not pleasure. Let me show you what Vikings ate to stay alive when fire was failing and food was scarce. But before we get to that, you need to understand just how desperate food supplies could become, and what people ate when standard preserved foods ran out. When both fire and food reach critical levels simultaneously, which happened regularly during the worst winters, you face a mathematical death spiral. Your body burns calories to generate heat. Without adequate food, your body can't generate heat. Without heat from fire or body, you freeze. Breaking this spiral required precise calorie management and willingness to consume foods that seem inedible. Vikings proved you can survive on remarkably little food if you choose the right types and manage energy expenditure carefully. The winter survival diet, when supplies were desperate, was calculated down to individual calories. The foundation was stockfish, dried cod that had been preserved to extreme desiccation. This food was literally perfect for crisis survival because it combined three critical properties. It was nearly imperishable, lasting years. It was incredibly lightweight and compact, making storage efficient, and it was almost pure protein with minimal water content. 100 grams of stockfish contained approximately 80 grams of protein, providing 320 calories. But here's the survival genius. Protein has the highest thermic effect of food, meaning digesting protein generates significant heat as a metabolic byproduct. When you eat protein, approximately 25 to 30% of its calories are released as waste heat during digestion. Eating 300 calories of stockfish protein generated 75 to 90 calories of pure heat that warmed your body from inside, independent of any external fire. This made protein the optimal survival food for cold conditions, even though it provided less total energy than fat. Vikings ate stockfish continuously during crisis periods, not just for nutrition, but for the internal heating effect. Fat was the second critical survival food. Pure animal fat contains 9 calories per gram, more than twice the energy density of protein or carbohydrates. During desperate periods, Vikings consumed fat in forms that would disgust modern people. Rendered fat was eaten directly, sometimes spread on the minimal bread available, sometimes consumed as spoonfuls of semi-solid grease, butter that had been preserved in peat bogs for months or years. Acquiring strong flavors, was brought out and consumed despite its taste. The fat from preserved meats was never discarded. Every drop was saved and eaten. Why? Because fat provided maximum calories per gram. And when you're rationing food desperately, calorie density is everything. 100 grams of fat provided 900 calories, enough to fuel basal metabolism for half a day. The metabolic heating from fat digestion was less than protein, but the sheer calorie content made it essential. The optimal survival ratio was approximately 60% calories from fat, 30% from protein, 10% from carbohydrates, This kept metabolic heat generation high while providing sufficient energy for minimal activity. Carbohydrates came primarily from grain stores, barley, and rye that had been preserved since harvest. These were made into thick porridges that required minimal fuel to prepare. The grain was soaked in cold water overnight to soften it, then briefly boiled in the morning when fire was maintained for cooking. The resulting porridge was dense, filling, and provided steady energy release over 4 to 6 hours. But carbohydrates alone won't keep you warm. They don't generate the metabolic heat that fat and protein provide. They were mainly consumed because they were available and stretched the more precious fat and protein supplies. Root vegetables stored in cellars, turnips, carrots provided additional carbohydrates and small amounts of vitamins that prevented deficiency diseases. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was a real danger during extended winters. Preserved berries, especially lingonberries that could be stored in water, provided minimal vitamin C that prevented scurvy even in tiny amounts. The meal timing strategy was critical. Vikings didn't eat 3 meals daily like modern people. During crisis periods, they ate twice daily at most, one small meal in morning after the overnight fast, and one larger meal in evening before sleep. Evening meal timing was calculated to maximize overnight heat generation. Eating immediately before sleep meant peak digestive heat production occurred 2 to 3 hours after eating. During the coldest pre-dawn hours, when body temperature naturally drops lowest, this strategic meal timing provided internal heating exactly when external heating was minimal. The total caloric intake during extreme crisis could drop to 1,200 to 1,500 calories per day per person, barely enough to maintain basal metabolism and minimal activity. Modern nutritionists would call this starvation ration. And it was starvation, just slow enough that people survived until spring. Weight loss during these periods was severe. Adults could lose 10 to 15 kilograms over a 3-month winter. But they survived, when even standard preserved foods ran low. Vikings consumed survival foods that reveal just how desperate conditions became. Dried seaweed was boiled into a gel-like substance that provided some nutrition, though it was nearly indigestible. Dried fish skins that had been discarded during preservation were soaked and boiled into a collagen-rich soup. Bone marrow was extracted from every preserved bone by cracking them open. Marrow is pure fat and highly nutritious. In absolute extremity, the leather from old shoes and belts was boiled for days to extract what minimal protein and gelatin they contained. This wasn't common, but it happened enough to be mentioned in sagas as signs of truly terrible winters. The willingness to eat these desperate foods separated survival from death. Pride and disgust are luxuries you cannot afford when freezing. The psychological survival during these desperate periods required mental strategies as sophisticated as the physical ones. The Yule Festival, celebrated during winter solstice, served critical psychological function. It marked the turning point when days began lengthening again, providing hope that spring would eventually return. During Yule, communities would sacrifice precious food stores for a brief feast. This seems wasteful, but it was calculated investment in morale. The psychological boost from one adequate meal and celebration could sustain people through weeks of continued hardship. They weren't just feeding bodies, they were feeding hope. The storytelling tradition reached its peak during the darkest periods. Saga recitation wasn't entertainment. It was oral history and cultural reinforcement that connected suffering people to their ancestors who had survived similar ordeals. When a skald recited sagas of heroes enduring terrible hardships, they were providing a psychological framework that made current suffering meaningful rather than random, cruel fate. The fatalistic worldview that all life follows predetermined patterns helped people accept hardship without descending into despair or rebellion that would fracture community cohesion. The religious rituals and sacrifices to gods served similar psychological function. Making offerings to Odin or Thor gave people sense of agency. They were doing something to influence their situation, even if that influence was spiritual rather than physical. This perception of control, even illusory control, is psychologically crucial for maintaining hope. Modern psychology confirms that people endure incredible hardship if they believe their actions matter and improvement is possible. Vikings built this belief system into their religious and cultural practices, specifically as survival tool. The bathhouse tradition continued even during crisis periods when heating water seemed wasteful. But it wasn't wasteful. It was psychological and medical necessity. The steam baths provided physical warmth that reached deep into bones, relieving the constant ache of being cold. The social gathering in bathhouses maintained community bonds. The cleanliness prevented the disease outbreaks that could kill more people than cold or hunger. Vikings understood that hygiene wasn't luxury, it was survival, necessity, when 40 people lived pressed together for months. The spring arrival was celebrated with intensity that modern people struggle to comprehend. The first day, when sunlight exceeded 12 hours, when ice began melting, when the first grass appeared, these weren't just seasonal changes. They were moments of genuine salvation. Communities that had survived the winter knew they had beaten death one more time. The ships were prepared, fields were planted, and the frantic race to accumulate resources for next winter began immediately.